subregions for Middle and South America, taking a small snapshot of each particular region and focusing a little bit more on some imagery and some details for each particular subregion or country. Now, the Caribbean, home to two of our territories is the United States, both the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Focus just a moment on Puerto Rico. Would be in 1898, the Spanish-American War. The U.S. acquires Puerto Rico from Spain, and it becomes our island territory filled with millions of American citizens, and we talked about them in previous slides regarding the destruction from the hurricanes and still the pursuit of power restoration and water restored to the region. We talked also about Grenada, which is the site of former British territory, now an independent country, where there was a revolution or a coup, post-revolution, now a coup. 1983, the United States becomes involved, and from there the story sort of ends between the United States and the country. There's not much more to say there, but just it is an area that is just slightly larger in geographic area than the city of Tallahassee, but about half the population. Just sort of put things in perspective. Not a large island, of course. It could be the size of our capital city here in Florida, which is not a major city, by a lot of standards. But again, U.S. intervention there in 1983. The Dutch settled the Netherlands Antilles, as well as other places, of course, in the region. We talked about that. But here, the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. Curacao is focused on here, where this is sort of Willemstad, the city. It's sort of a tourist destination in large parts. Also, other economic activities exist within the Caribbean, but here you have some European architecture with some Caribbean flavor, Caribbean motif to it, and just sort of a picture that you may think of when you think of the typical Caribbean. And we have Montego Bay, Jamaica, again, another area that's dominated by the tourist industry, recently been flagged for travel advisories for crime rate increases in both theft and murder in the area. So there's been some travel advisories from the United States and from Canada saying to be cautious, maybe don't leave the resorts. I imagine there to be a relatively swift pushback on that from Jamaica to sort of crack down on this issue, because an area that relies on tourism cannot afford to have a reputation of being dangerous, so they have to straighten things out, or else folks aren't going to be so keen on going there. So this is what we may think of the Caribbean. Here's a little bit more of the historical aspect of things, a little bit more of the modern aspect of things. We'll pull two places out to really contrast each other, but you may think of the Caribbean as the pictures on the right there, just to frame a little bit of our historical involvement here on the left. Now, to pull one out, Haiti, Port-au-Prince, Haiti, as well the entire country, of course, suffered the earthquake, but most notably Port-au-Prince on January 12th, 2010, nearly 8 years ago. Obviously, the infrastructure was a bit subpar to begin with, not prepared for a magnitude 7 or earthquake. Nevertheless, they were hit with this. 64% of Haitians still do not have access to clean water. And so this is, again, something that the Haitian people were faced with, and increasingly strong storms, flooding, or other issues that they now face in the wake of climate change. But this earthquake that rocked the country 8 years ago is of most notable importance. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands more are rendered homeless, and literally a city turned to rubble. And something to focus on, sort of moving from the earthquake, would be the historical deforestation that has taken place in Haiti, unlike what we'd see in the Dominican Republic. Now, because of the physical geography of the island of Hispaniola, the mountains at this part of in the area of Haiti and leave it a bit more semi-arid than that of the Dominican Republic. So farming is already a bit more challenging in that area. It's obviously a poor country, the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, most underdeveloped in the Western Hemisphere. And on top of that, agriculture is their way of life for the most part, and even that is pretty tough with the physical geography of the area. And because of that amount of deforestation that took place, you can see a stark difference at the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The lack of natural forest cover has, again, made the area more vulnerable to flooding, different landslides, of course, in times of flooding, and flooding in the sense that there's just not that cover to soak in all that additional rainfall when it does come. And also increased storms. That's nothing that deforestation sort of is the culprit for. But again, these areas were cleared for sugarcane production and other agricultural endeavors throughout the centuries, and then it sort of trickled more into the idea that they've used wood as a fuel source. Of course, oil is expensive to the Haitian people, and so they've turned to using charcoal as an energy source, which has continued and perpetuated the lack of tree cover in the country, and so that problem has only gotten worse. And there's been a campaign in Haiti to reforest many parts of the country, many parts of the area that would be considered wilderness if there would be anything there. So there is campaigns to promote, to plant trees and promote ecological integrity in the area. Now, of course, I pull out Haiti in particular, and I don't want to only show you pictures of the deforestation and the earthquake, because I easily could have showed you a picture that would have looked like Montego Bay, Jamaica, and I could have showed you the beautiful wonders of the mountains of Haiti, and the beautiful beaches and the natural environment. I did want to focus a bit on sort of the disadvantages that the country faces because of its physical geography and its decades of oppression because of European colonization, and sort of just the troubling facts that it has faced in the wake of the president's racist remarks that were uncalled for and distasteful and just quite wrong, in the sense that this country is in fact vibrant in a lot of different ways. However, I highlight some of these facts to you to situate where that language comes from, but in fact push back that language is in fact both racist and wrong. The last sort of country to highlight from the Caribbean as a region would be that of Cuba. Seen here is the corner of Cretans, where you have George Bush Sr., and Ronald Reagan, all of course right-wing or right-leaning politicians in the United States that were in opposition to socialism and communism in Cuba. So obviously painted in a negative light from their perspective, and the Cuban people, or at least the Cuban government, through the Museum of the Revolution, paints them in this way. Definitely not friends of theirs. Again, I mentioned it before in a different presentation, but from 1959, there was a revolution that took place. The revolution led by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and others. Eventually, Fidel Castro takes power from 1976 to 2008. He steps down, passes away a few years later. His brother, Raul Castro, currently the leader of Cuba, he too plans to step down, and so there'll be another passage of power to another a leader coming up in a mere months. So we'll stay tuned for that. It'll be the first time in nearly half a century that somebody other than one of the Castro brothers will control Cuba. So it'll be quite interesting to check out once we get to that point. A country of 12 million people. This is the city of Havana, the capital city. It's rural, agricultural dependent outside of the capital city, and particularly the old part of the city as seen here in these images. Fidel Castro largely comes under fire, not for the sense of his socialism when he tried to promote an improvement in egalitarianism and an improvement in investment in social programs, but rather his oppression of his people when he jailed or killed those who disagreed with him politically, which left a lot of people fleeing the country, which 90 miles away, they come to Florida and elsewhere, and they start a new life. Mexico, our neighbor to the south, we know that we share 2,000 miles of the border with them because we talked about it before. We talked about the role of the maquiladora, which is the factories that are a major economic staple in the Mexican economy. So we won't go too much further from that economic sector because I think that was covered enough previously. Here, the El Castillo and the Chichen Itza area of Mexico, former Mayan ruins in the southeastern portion of the country of Mexico on that Yucatan Peninsula. Tourist destination now, but of course the site of the Mayan people, one of the first civilizations, and a prominent one of that. If you recall, I talked about the elusiveness of Pablo Escobar in my previous presentation. I mentioned that he was caught and escaped multiple times and was responsible for 500 tons of drugs in the United States. I misspoke on that. I was thinking of El Chapo and not Pablo Escobar. So if you caught that error, maybe you didn't know about it either way. If you caught the error, good for you. That's your prize. There is no other prize. But just to clear that up, that was in fact El Chapo, what I was describing. Pablo Escobar was in fact the king of cocaine, did have a net worth of near $56 billion, making him one of the richest men in the world at his peak before he was eventually killed. But that was Pablo Escobar, responsible for drug activity in Colombia and into Miami and the United States, of course, but focusing here on El Chapo, who ran the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. Again, elusive in the fact that he was would be caught and released many times. His current status is that he is imprisoned, but again, responsible for a lot of drugs that made their way into the United States. Lastly is Mexico City, pictured here, a large, definitely a large city. If we think Denver is a city that's high in elevation in this country, it's a mile-high city in terms of 5,280 feet high in elevation. This is 2,000 feet higher yet, about 7,300 feet high in elevation. And again, its population 300,000 people larger than New York City. So population of 8.8 million people in Mexico City, and if you would take its entire metropolitan area, you would add millions and millions of people more, making it, of course, a primate city, like we mentioned, a city of economic and political activity, definitely the center for the Mexican economy. Central America. Now, a fun fact for this presentation, I don't know what you consider fun. I consider this a fun fact, so take it as you will, but it takes 6 to 8 hours for a ship to cross through the Panama Canal. This is something that I just learned recently and that needs to be shared, in my opinion. So something to think about there. The 1800s, France tried to build a canal but hit some engineering problems. A lot of its people were dying of mosquito-borne diseases at the time because they were not able to combat that during their work throughout the jungle at the time, dealing in an area of proximity to water. So they pulled out of that. 1904, the United States becomes involved, and from 1904 to 1914, the United States constructs the Panama Canal. 1914, it's a go. Since then, it's faced some small changes where it's widened and deepened at different times to upkeep with different shipping vessels. As you can imagine, ships have changed since 1914. We're talking well over 100, well, not well over, but over 100 years at this point. In 1977, U.S. President Jimmy Carter signed with the leader of Panama the Torrijos-Carter Treaty, which would, in 77, eventually turn over the Panama Canal and Panama Canal Zone back to the Panamanians, and that eventually took place by the year 2000. So over the course of those decades, the United States would withdraw and again give that area back to Panama, which, as you can imagine, was quite popular from the Panamanian side of things. Nicaragua, here pictured here, Granada, Nicaragua, off of Lake Nicaragua, is an area that had experienced the idea of a canal multiple times, perhaps in different interests from different actors, including the United States, of building a canal through Nicaragua before the Panama Canal. Because this lake is quite large, you wouldn't have to build a canal as far as one may think through that country, while it isn't as narrow as Panama. However, that was foregone. Some Chinese investment had perhaps revitalized the issue a few years back. However, there are no immediate plans to proceed with the Nicaraguan canal, despite talks for some time of having one by 2050. They have since sort of doubled down on the natural beauty of their country, the natural environment and local environment, being somewhat of a model or a template from Costa Rica, Costa Rica, as you can see here, Manuel Antonio Park in Quepos, Costa Rica, is one of my favorite places. It's very tranquil, beautiful pristine beaches, beautiful tree cover and forests. You swim while the monkeys are coming out of the trees and stealing your wallet, and so what Nicaragua has done is they've seen, since they can't sort of follow the Panamanian example of having a canal and ruining their natural environment, yes, at least in the canal zone, they are now sort of becoming an idea of another eco-tourist country that it could be maybe considered slightly cheaper than that of Costa Rica. So following, again, a similar model. El Salvador went through a civil war from 1979 to 1992, and since then has really reestablished itself in the region as best it can, but it's a very densely populated country sitting on the Pacific Ocean. Poor in nature, of course, based on decades of civil war, but again, like all of these countries in the region, are emerging, some slower than others, of course. You go back one. I want to note something about Costa Rica. Something else about Costa Rica is in 1948, after Civil War, they abolished their military and invested that money in social programs, which eventually led to high literacy rates and quite a good education system. And since then, they established a national healthcare system that does leave it to be one of the nicest and most productive in the region. The Caja and the Social Security system in Costa Rica, sort of an outlier in the region that makes Costa Rica and Panama because of the canal, Costa Rica because of the healthcare system and ecotourism, really countries that stand out as being relatively prosperous. Now we're moving on. Northern Andes and Caribbean coast, Caracas, Venezuela. If you remember, Venezuela, Caracas is capital of Venezuela. Venezuela, the country once led by Hugo Chavez, who, remember, passed away in 2013 from cancer after leading there for a little over a decade, had a nationalized oil system because he came from that sort of champion of the poor populist movement. You see rice production here in Guyana. Guyana is a part of three smaller countries that are situated just north of Brazil on the Caribbean coast. Guyana, formerly settled by the British, gained independence from them in 1966. Suriname, just one country to the east, gained independence in 1975 from the Netherlands, from the Dutch. And then one more country to the east, French Guiana, remains part of France to this day. But here, again, focus on the rainforest in Colombia. This is an area where, as in the mountainous areas, particularly in the northwest portion of the country, is where a lot of that cocaine and illicit drug activity came from. The areas of these forests are filled with FARC guerrillas. These are a political faction that can be considered quite dangerous. And there's a gap here in the Pan American Highway, a highway that runs the entire length of North America and Central America and South America. But for an area of about 100 miles, the road does not continue through these forested mountain areas of Colombia, where it's referred to as the Darien Gap in the Darien Forest. And so that's sort of no political will to continue that road forward, as it would have negative ecological impacts on the region right now. And the area isn't perhaps the safest in all of Colombia. But Colombia has worked hard to shed that dangerous label that was largely responsible from Pablo Escobar and the cocaine activity from the 1980s, and they've again worked hard to emerge from that to become a center for much more. So the Central Andes, it'd be worth noting from the beginning that 50% of the population in this region are indigenous peoples. Obviously the economies are, how we would say, versatile or well-rounded, but I want to focus just briefly on this one of the wonders of the world in Machu Picchu. It's a tourist destination now, but once part of the civilization of an ancient empire outside of Cusco, Peru, and it's usually not this clear of a shot. It's usually a bit more cloudy because of cloud coverage and moisture, but again, it was one of the tourist destinations in the country, but you have fishing industry on the coast, you have agricultural practices elsewhere. The Andes Mountains, of course, like seen here, do create a barrier for some different types of industries where the Andes Mountains are located. Guayaquil, Ecuador is included in this picture. However, Ecuador is worth noting. I put them on this slide. Again, country that's positioned on the equator, but it's the first in the world to recognize the rights of nature and to provide certain rights, recognizing rights for ecosystems. And this is due large in part probably because the Galapagos Islands are part of this country, islands that are being preserved to the best of their ability, home of the Galapagos tortoise and some of these other sort of wonders of the world, if you will. Ecologically rich area that's quite isolated in terms of it's a small chain of islands in the Pacific Ocean, and that's created an eco-tourist destination as well. However, due to the amount of foot traffic that's happening, they had to instill a quota of how many travelers could visit there per year, not to damage it, damage the local environment. Bolivia is a landlocked country in, of course, the Andes mountain range. It's known as resource cursed, perhaps, and resource cursed is where an area has resources, a wealth of natural resources, in this case tin, however, are weak politically or economically speaking, and that could be for a whole host of reasons, some perhaps corruption or lack of transparency. However, this country does have a relatively weak economy and is rich in natural resources. Here is an innovation from an urban transportation perspective, the Mi Teleferico, or My Cable Car, linking the cities of La Paz and El Alto through a cable car that comes sort of different elevations to alleviate some level of traffic. The southern cone, I think, is pretty interesting in the sense that there's stark contrast between the urban centers and the rural centers, or even something that's beyond rural when you see completely isolated like the Atacama Desert. So back to when I was saying before, the U.S. involvement in Operation Condor, where the U.S. CIA provided communications and weapons in covert operations in the 1970s, along with France as an actor as well, ruining the regimes of the likes of Allende for Pinochet, who, again, through three countries in this region, not just Chile, but Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, lost 50,000 people, many more jailed and imprisoned, but lost that many lives because of U.S. Foreign involvement. Since then, areas like Santiago, Chile, and Buenos Aires, Argentina have rebounded to become economic and cultural hubs for the continent, along the lines of Rio de Janeiro. These two cities really begin to emerge as some of the major cities of the entire continent, and have really pushed well beyond those unfortunate events that took place at the hands of the American government and others decades ago. And you can see here the Pampas in Argentina, lowlands area that's used predominantly for ranching and other types of of activity, quite rural in comparison to this dense urban center of the capital city. And likewise with the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, if you remember, it's that dry, cool desert that's as a result of the rain shadow that takes place in Chile in the Andes Mountains. Brazil is the last region in the subregion section. It's an entire country in itself. If you remember, fifth largest country in terms of human population and geographic area. We've already learned about favelas through watching City of God and by seeing some of the water scarcity issues that have taken place throughout the different slides. We know that there's no urban infrastructure in terms of utilities and sewage and water systems, and so we would know that what that impact is on the people that live in favelas in Brazil. Now, slash and burn agriculture is a long time practice of how to remove the forest, how deforestation takes place in different parts of the world. 1970s, you remember that sort of concern for the rate of slash and burn agriculture piqued the interest in Brazil, and so that has begun to slow to a certain extent. But as a result, it was, slash and burn agriculture was taking place for ranching and for different agricultural endeavors, for sugarcane production, which the Brazilians use, like we use corn for ethanol, they use sugarcane for ethanol production. From 2015-16, they produced 8 billion gallons. If you remember, if that sounds like a lot, it is a lot, but they do have hundreds of millions of people, large country, so the demand is also there. Rio de Janeiro, though, has hosted the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Summer Olympic Games, and so these are these mega events that the city has begun to host. It's really showcased itself as a BRICS country, as an emerging country around the world in terms of its economic development, and so it's showcased itself in a positive light in that sense. However, I want to talk about the mega events, the role of urban infrastructure and disease outbreak, because I have you focus on this. It's not in the book because this sort of outbreak occurs simultaneously with the book being in production, I assume. I don't know if they would have included it in the book. However, I include it now because I do think it's important, an important opportunity to learn something about mosquito-borne diseases, and because I care about mosquito-borne diseases, I of course have to include it, or want to include it, but I'll keep it short. So what we have is the Zika virus, originally from the Zika forest in Uganda in Africa. And it's been present there for decades, on and off, but because of that time, in a remote area, you didn't see the interconnectedness of the world and globalization at that time, so the disease stayed relatively hidden. Now, Zika had popped up in different places around the world, and then more recently, most recently, would have been Zika in the South Pacific, in the Yap Islands. And you saw Brazil hosting some of these mega events, and what happens is that these folks come to compete, perhaps in a rowing competition or in the mega events that were taking place in Brazil, hosting a rowing event as well as these major events like FIFA and the Olympics. What happened was you had a large percentage of people that did not have any immunity or previous exposure to the Zika virus. And couple that with living in areas like favelas, which are densely populated areas with, let's face it, terrible urban infrastructure, because there was simply no planning at the municipal level because these areas just popped up due to squatting. You left the perfect recipe for disease outbreak and epidemics, high rates of transmission. And we know because the Aedes mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito most notably, was present in this region. It's a mosquito that relies on humans for its food, as its blood meal. And it's a mosquito that usually doesn't fly too far away from the urban environment. It usually lives and breeds in tires and bottle caps and gutters and water storage containers that are in part due because of the lack of running water in some of these places. And so when you have mosquitoes that can transmit the disease living in areas like this, with dense human populations living very close to each other with no previous immunity or exposure to disease. That's why you had the disease outbreak of Zika that you did in Brazil, and then to a lesser extent around the rest of the Americas. Which takes us to what, not only what Zika was, but what it sort of became as a disease burden for following suit. Now, 80% of Zika cases are believed to be asymptomatic, meaning you don't even know you have it because you don't show symptoms. Symptoms are usually flu-like or severe flu-like symptoms. However, we've seen associations with Guillain-Barré syndrome and microcephaly in cases of certain Zika cases. And so now what we see are when women are pregnant or recently pregnant and become infected with Zika virus, we can see that sometimes the child may not experience the proper development of the skull and lead obviously to birth defects like microcephaly. And that's left, to the extent of many babies being born with physical disabilities that will be lifelong disabilities, and that will eventually become a burden on the healthcare system and social programs of that of Brazil and any place where those that have microcephaly take place. And so I mention that because, again, this is something that in turn is quite important to Brazil. Because of sexual transmission of Zika virus, unlike other mosquito-borne diseases like dengue fever and chikungunya virus or yellow fever, we see it hard to control the mosquito population if it could be transmitted through a sexual transmission. And so luckily, as the virus has continued to run through the population, the spread of disease has slowed, and the future of Zika, like any mosquito-borne disease, is to be foreseen. Now that wraps up Middle and South America. You should have by now watched Middle and South America Part 1, Middle and South America Part 2, and we'll be moving on to Europe next week, so stay tuned.